We are going to come out of recess and continue our meeting on item 10 on tonight's agenda, which is the manager's report, being held here to continue our conversation of the future and fate of the village's stormwater utility and how best to pay for stormwater projects going forward. And as we usually do under the manager's report, we ask the village manager, Dave Fieldman, to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Mayor Tully. As the mayor just said, we're here to talk about our top priority action item, consider changes to the stormwater utility. We've been working on this top priority action item for several months. This is the third or fourth public meeting in a series on this topic. At the last public meeting, the council made a lot of progress and gave staff very clear direction on some of the next steps. The first thing that happened at the last meeting was the council provided direction that we should establish a revenue budget of $3.9 million in the stormwater fund for fiscal year 17. That is the amount that you can find in our multi-year plan for funding stormwater. And so with that direction, we are going about preparing the draft FY17 budget with revenues equal to $3.9 million. The question that was on the table last week, and we'll talk about it this time, is what is the source of that revenue of that $3.9 million? And the council directed staff to prepare for consideration a series of referendum questions, advisory questions that would appear on the November ballot to inform the council about resident opinions on what the revenue sources should be or could be. So with that, we have actually prepared three draft referendum advisory questions as directed by the council. And we also learned that we have the ability as a municipality to put a footnote on each of the ballot questions that could help frame up or explain or put context to the ballot question that the voters are considering. So the draft or proposed referendum questions are one on each whiteboard, and they are numbered. I thought we would go through and get council direction and concurrence on the language of each of those three questions. Once we have that, we can work a little bit on the footnotes that might appear with those ballot questions. Well, one last reminder as we go into this, for ballot questions to be effective, they should be easy to understand, they should be factual and not misleading or not vague. And that also applies to any footnotes that we put on. So factual, not misleading, not vague. With that, Mayor, I can hand it over to you, and I would suggest we start with draft question number one, and I will track any changes that the council would propose.
Thanks for the introduction. I actually think in order to assess this properly, we have to look at all the questions together, because this is an attempt to try to get some information from the community in a simple manner. And the way we're trying to do that is by posing three questions. So I don't think we can look at one question in isolation in order to do editing, sure. But I think we have to look at all three questions together in order to assess whether we're really going to capture the information that we want. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. Number one, the order of these questions I think is important. Should number one go first or should number two go first? I think a case can be made for either one. And I'll explain why that's important in a minute. The other question I just have is whether we want to add any adjectives before, in question one and number two, prior to the word through. Right now it just says funding through. Is that exclusively? Is that principally? And do we want to have any adjectives at all? I'm just going to throw out some questions right now for my colleagues, and then we can have a conversation about it, but I really think I want to talk about all three questions first before coming back to wordsmithing a particular language. The third question I'm struggling with because it is, I just think it's confusing. I also think it's never going to get checked. I think what you're going to have happen, and this is one thing I think we need to be very pragmatic about, is what's actually going to happen in the ballot box. With all due respect to voters, where this is going to appear on a potentially long ballot, whether folks are going to actually make it all the way through it. The order becomes important for that reason. It also becomes an issue of if you think you've answered the first two questions, you're not quite sure how the third one is different in a very short read. It may not even get acted upon. So I think that we need to work, I don't have an answer for this yet, but I think we need to work on number 3. I understand what we're trying to capture number 3. They're asking him the hybrid question. You want to do part one way and part the other way, but I think in the attempt to make it as simple as possible, you have to read it a couple times if you haven't seen it before to really gauge what it's talking about. And for that reason, I think it's not going to capture as currently written the information that we want to get, which is unfair. Footnote, I think it's a great discovery that we can do footnotes, but some at this table will tell you that there is a school of thought that says that A, people don't read footnotes, and B, if something is important, put it in the text. If it's in the footnote, you're signaling that it's not important. There are two different schools of thought on that. I'm not suggesting we don't have footnotes, because if we can try to provide context again for the 3 questions, and here again, this is why this is really a holistic approach. The footnote explains how these 3 relate to one another. They're not independent questions on unrelated topics. They are 3 interrelated questions trying to get basically one answer from the community on a very important topic. And then I'll wrap up with the thoughts about, let's again be pragmatic about this, and think about whatever result we get back from these questions as they are ultimately constituted, how are we going to interpret that information? What I mean by that is you can envision a situation where someone votes no, no, no. What does that tell you?
Tells you no.
Well, that was a rhetorical question. Well, what that means is they don't want to pay for any stormwater. Except that's not what the community tells us. We have stormwater issues we have to pay for. I suspect if we put road construction up there, we get no, no, no. I suspect if we got police and fire, we might get no, no, no. But that's unrealistic and not very helpful information. So I think in order to, I'm not suggesting that we have to go to the level of being data scientists about this, but I think we need to be realistic and pragmatic about what some likely outcomes are going to be and what does that tell us. So for example, if you get 40% no here, 50% no there, 30% no there, what does that mean? And knowing that that might happen, are there things that we can do to try to anticipate that and make sure that we're capturing helpful information? Because otherwise, if we throw this out there and we don't get any meaningful input, then we're put in a position, or future councils are put in a position of having data that they can be held to be not responsive to, and that it's very difficult to interpret what it means. So again, I just wanted to throw out those comments about all 3 questions holistically, and then we can go into anybody's thoughts on individual language or otherwise.
I have a holistic response, because first of all, everything that you just said I found quite insightful, and it's really advanced my thinking in the last 4 or 5 minutes. Because of that, I'm now concerned about question 3 being confusing, and that we won't get meaningful data out of number 3. This is entirely my personal opinion, but this is where I would see myself in December with a certain hypothetical result. If 1 and 2 were essentially tied, I would very strongly support splitting it into 2 parts. And I might not need the 3rd question. So if about half the people want it through stormwater fee and half the people want it through property tax or other sources, we can still tweak that, or it's reasonably close, 52-48, you know, whatever the bright line is. I'm going to say with that result, we need to split it. In which case, we don't need question 3. We can just go with 2. And as a spur of the moment thing, I thought of in the last 5 minutes. But all of your comments I thought were very insightful and helpful. I do want to throw out right away what hopefully is a minor nit we can all agree on very quickly. The word expenses in the accounting world has a very specific meaning that excludes capital projects. I would suggest we take the word expenditure, and that's just something, because expenses is a term of art in the accounting and tax world. And if we use that word, we could confuse people. Or all stormwater spending
Costs.
Yeah, or actually, well, you know, all stormwater spending might be more clear to people. I don't know, but the word expenses, people will jump to conclusions about what it means opposite of what we intend it to mean. I don't want that to dominate the discussion, guys.
Once we get to the language level,
Yeah.
and at some point in time, I'm going to apologize to this room in advance. Yes, we will be nitpicking about the difference between a that and a which. That's how referenda questions are made.
This is bigger than that, but that's... Yeah.
We're not there yet.
Yeah.
We're still talking about this conceptually. But if you want to be really simple about it, you would say, shall the village pay for stormwater costs of X, Y, and Z through very simple, straightforward
Well,
smaller words.
that's actually where I was going to go with it, Mayor, is I think, I share your concern that question 3 is kind of unruly, but I think you can simplify it by simply saying, and we can wordsmith this later, but I think the concept is it's a mixture of a stormwater utility fee and the property tax. And I think you could put it a little more simply.
Show the-
Stormwater expenditures through a
combination.
combination
Yeah,
of
right.
a
You
fee
could say-
and property tax.
Right, I guess that would work.
You have a choice. You have X, Y, or a combination.
Right.
And because
okay
I
with that
thought
too,
you,
yeah.
because I think you could do that.
That's how-
my
Apples,
first
oranges,
thought-
or fruit salad.
Right, right. And my first thought,
apples and
reading the
oranges
3
only.
questions, was
No cherries or
that
bananas.
with 1 and 2, we're kind of repeating ourselves, because chances are if, and I think it's a very high probability that if you favor the stormwater utility fee, you would not favor the property tax, and vice versa. But I came to a different conclusion when we started thinking about the footnotes, because I think it's important that folks understand, and I think this is where and I share the concern that maybe people won't read the footnotes. I think you're right about that, Mayor. But I think we have to put the information out there. Look, we have a stormwater budget of approximately $3.9 million, and if it doesn't come from X source, it comes from Y source. Otherwise, we have to get out a very large scalpel. And I think it's important that folks understand that. The money comes from somewhere. It's got a source.
Well, I think that's the reason to have 2 questions in the beginning, is to try to convey through the questions themselves that there's an either or. You notice what's not up here.
No.
Don't pay for anything.
Exactly, yeah.
No, it's really what we're trying to get is, do you want this or that?
Right.
And I think that's why the 2 questions there, it reinforces that alternative choice in the questions themselves.
I agree.
The third one, I'm not saying get rid of 3. I'm just saying as currently written, 3, I just think is going to risk being not addressed or misunderstood, or, well, how is this any different than what I just answered?
Right.
I'm not saying
I
get
think
rid
we
of
run
it.
into that because they're so,
But
they're
his suggestion
very
works.
closely worded. They're very similarly worded, I guess is
Yeah, I
a better way
think
to say
so.
it. That, yeah, you do run the risk that somebody glosses over it.
Yeah, and maybe I think the word fee, I think people are a little angry about the fee itself because of how much it jumps, the fee is raised and raised and raised. I think people are angry about that, so I don't know, I'm looking at it and thinking, well, people think, no, I hate the fee, and that's that. So I think, we were talking earlier, maybe an educational campaign on really letting the public know what this means, like what does stormwater mean, and you're right, it's a huge problem in our village. The money needs to come from somewhere. This doesn't mean that, we don't need the money and that there's not going to be some sort of payment process. So, but I think, people are upset that the fee is so much and it keeps going up. So, that could be,
and they're
that
also-
could be a point, people will see that and be like, well, I just hate it, and done. So I don't know.
Timing is important too, because I don't know
Yeah.
about you, but there's been some mail showing up at everyone's house,
Yep.
property tax bills, and from what I'm hearing, they're showing an across-the-board increase of between 7 and 10% increases. Someone opens up that envelope and sees this is the second question, you're gonna get the same reaction.
Right, so,
That's
no,
exactly-
I'm not saying that
That's
the
why we
word
need
fee
both
shouldn't be in
questions.
there, and I do
It's not
like
10%
both
across
questions,
the
and they
village,
should be
it's 10% of the
easy and
higher-
clear. But
more wealthy homes.
I also think people, have these, thoughts about the fee, and
Right.
they're not good,
And just for the
so.
record, the Village of Downers Grove is only about 8% of that.
So,
Having some empathy for the voter that has probably stood in line and wants to cast a vote for a number of things, I looked at these 3 questions, I says, they're way more complex than they need to be. How many voters are really gonna wake up, or are they gonna fall asleep when they see the word capital? And it's more complex than it needs to be. Plus, these 3 questions leave out what I would hope would be a third option. I would start off the questions by saying the village, something of the nature of the Village of Downers Grove is required to address stormwater issues. Question 1 being, shall they be paid for out of property taxes? Number 2, shall they be paid for out of a stormwater fee? And number 3, should they be paid out of property taxes and stormwater fee that applies only to those who do not pay property taxes. And as a footnote, I would put something in there about we are required to address the issues, and they are currently being paid for by a stormwater fee, so that they're informed when they go in, they can see that currently this is being paid for by a stormwater fee. They get a choice: property taxes, stormwater fee, or property taxes. And if I don't, and for people who aren't paying a property tax, they pay a stormwater fee.
Because the
Very
problem's not
simple.
gonna go away. I mean, we need the
Right.
money.
Well,
It's
You gotta
not
keep
gonna
it
go
simple. It's
away.
This
capital.
made me think of the person that, if the fee question is first, and they don't like the fee, they see that, they fill in the little oval, then they go to the next one, and go, oh, wait a minute, I'm gonna go back and change my oval. Can't.
You get a new
You gotta
ballot.
spoil the ballot.
No, yeah, okay, that's gonna happen.
Plus,
It
plus
does
in the
happen.
meantime, you have all
Kids
this
pull on the
education.
jacket, late for school.
I mean, you have an educational process. There'll be a lot of discussion, things in papers
I think
and,
that's important.
and online that happens beforehand. But I think when you start talking about capital versus other expenses, you start differentiating. The average person at home is going to pick up on that.
I don't disagree.
They say either taxes, property taxes, or stormwater fee.
So I think it's, from my perspective, it's important that we have both these first two questions, no doubt about it. You can't just say, should we collect a fee? Because if you say, people are gonna say no, and it's not, this allows that.
Right, well, if you just put the tax question up, they'd say no too.
I guess it's not
Correct.
should we collect a fee. We are collecting a fee.
And you put
Right.
that in the footnotes, currently being paid for by a fee.
Right.
This goes back to getting information that we have to understand is going to be subject to interpretation afterwards. I think we need to put that on the table right now.
Well,
Whatever we get back, we
interpretation by
have
us.
to interpret.
Well, and from my
Let's
perspective.
establish a framework for doing that now rather than figuring out later how to interpret.
Well, I think I don't think we can establish a clear framework now because there's so many possibilities of what could happen. But I could imagine a possibility where 90% people vote no on the stormwater fee and 60% of the people vote no on property tax. Clear, people don't want to pay for anything. Well, that's clear. But
Under
clearly,
50% don't want to pay anything.
property tax is less objectionable than the stormwater fee, right? There's that argument can be made. At least from my perspective, this point about simplification of the questions even further is somewhat compelling. I mean, do we need to state operations, maintenance, capital projects, and bond debt payments? Do we need to, outline all those pieces? I'm not totally convinced we do. The other point I have is, do people understand? Does people in general understand what stormwater means? What, all stormwater expenses or stormwater expenditures or stormwater spending or stormwater costs, do they understand what that means? And do we need to, bring it into common everyday language even
Yes.
further?
Well,
Mhm.
I think we have to use the word stormwater.
I think you have to use the word
For better or for
stormwater.
worse.
yeah, I do too.
Well, that's fine, but I'm suggesting, do we need to provide some interpretive guidance about what the stormwater system is? I mean,
Well, I think we do that
For
before.
public education,
Right.
on the-
Not,
Right.
not, we're not gonna do it.
Well, by the way, we're gonna have a conversation about this as we do as a council, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll continue our conversation later. So I appreciate everyone's patience while we make the sausage here.
Well,
I agree with the point about operations, maintenance, capital projects, and bond debt payments. And my goodness, there's people who've been on this council didn't understand what that means, much less expecting somebody to necessarily understand that. And that's not to somehow disparage the intelligence of our residents. It's just a practical reality of people have very busy lives, and there are going to be a million things on the ballot, and expecting someone to focus on the details of what capital and bond debt repayments for stormwater necessarily are. Where we could say something as simple as, shall the village of Downers Grove pay for the cost of its stormwater program through X? Because what are we trying to get?
Yeah.
We're really trying to get an idea
John, on
whether.
that? Because I think we can jump ahead really quickly if I just waiting for Bob.
Because I was working on something similar in my head, I like that.
Yeah.
Got it.
Martin?
Short Anglo-Saxon words.
Because what are we trying to really capture? We're really trying to capture whether people prefer paying it through a utility fee or through property taxes. The "it" can be, I think, more simply defined.
Or pay it through my property taxes, and if somebody else is
I vote to
paying
pay
it-
for it through your property taxes.
No, pay for it through stormwater. If you aren't paying taxes, you pay for it through a
Right.
fee.
Well, Greg, and then let's
I'm
hear
not
from
sure
Bob.
that's legal.
I've just got a structural question. Bill kind of raised an interesting, sorry, I should specify, Bill Walden raised an interesting, I think, structural piece here. Can we, in addition to or in substitution for a footnote, can we get a preamble?
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah, I liked your idea of the Village of Downers Grove, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we could set all three questions up by saying the Village of Downers Grove stormwater, budget for stormwater projects
This
for
includes blah, 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 blah.
2016 is 3 point whatever it is million dollars.
Not a bad idea.
Or for 2017 is $3.9 million. It covers X, Y, and Z, and then cut right to the questions. Boom, boom, boom.
So basically put the footnote as the preamble.
Right.
Can we do that?
So that it's all right there up front.
And then it's just
2
one,
lines.
not three.
Well, the problem, we would restate it 3 times because I think on the electronic ballot, it actually shows up.
Oh.
It's 3 separate, it won't appear as.
Right,
So
each
we
question.
actually just restate it 3 times.
Each question has the preamble
It can't be
or the
law.
footnote.
Yes.
No, yeah, it's got to
There's
be.
only
It
one
can't be
electronic-
long.
There's only one
It's
electronic
gotta be-
ballot at my polling place anyway. Nobody waits for it.
But early voting.
Early voting.
Is all,
Yeah,
that's
that's
right.
all, that's right.
and there's
All right,
a quarter
fair
of
point.
votes will be cast early.
Fair point.
But just to check in, what I'm hearing is simplify it and get to the question of should we continue to fund stormwater expenses through a fee? Should we use property taxes or a combination of fees and property taxes? That's the simple gist of it.
Isn't that the gist of what we're
And
trying to
not
capture?
trying to tie, the reason that was all in there was because we thought it was important at the time to tie the fee to something and the.
This
tax
isn't,
to
this isn't a
not.
criticism, this is just.
Oh, no, I just want to make sure we're, okay, we're cool with that. We just want to
And
make
if they say
sure.
to split it, we'll decide how to
Split it into
Right.
the,
Yeah.
And
okay,
if
got
we
it.
drop this, we can get even, if we don't do the combination question, then I think those 2 questions can become even simpler.
Well, this could be simple too.
Very
Should it be a
basic.
combination of fees and taxes?
I'm not ready to throw that out, I just thought it was
That's it.
confusing.
And then
No.
we decide what the combination is.
Right, because.
But you have to make sure the question is, really a question, not an opinion. Like, people need to understand that we're going to make a decision and the money's coming from something, like, shall we? That almost indicates that, well, we may not. Do you know what I mean? Like, people need to understand that we're getting the
It's
money.
mandatory
from-
language, but it's an advisory referendum.
Okay,
It's
all
not
right,
binding.
I just, want to make sure that,
But with this preamble language that we've talked about, I think the preamble language, from what I am hearing, is the preamble language states what effectively, the preamble language helps define what stormwater, whether it's stormwater expenses, costs, expenditures, spending, right? The preamble helps define exactly what that
Stormwater
means.
is.
Yes.
And I like that idea, because then as long as it's brief and, all that.
Yeah.
But I like the idea of, you got a little brief preamble, you have a simple question. You have effectively three simple questions. Should we fund through a fee? Should we fund through property taxes instead of a fee? Or should we fund through a combination of both?
This is, do you want chocolate ice cream, do you want vanilla ice cream, do you want Neapolitan? That's what it is.
Right. I totally agree.
right, but it
Twist,
has to
better.
be something. It is,
That's really what it comes down to.
right.
And I think that this is what we're talking about here is these very simple questions, really cut to that chase.
The simpler the better.
And maybe if you put in for the stormwater fee, you say remain, and when you talk about property taxes, you use
Yeah,
change.
that could be.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Bob, I know you've been tempted with the reference to ice cream.
Got my attention there. I
What are your thoughts?
I totally agree on removing the including capital blah, blah, blah. I'd suggest a couple things. The first 2 questions, I think, should be as closely as possible worded the same, because you really are asking for a choice to be made. When we, on the second question, say instead of, I'm not sure that that's useful, or if it ought to be included in the first one. I think they need to be worded worded basically the same. One asking, do you like a tax or do you like a fee?
Bob, on that point,
Yeah.
rather than just saying on this one, you say through the property tax levy instead of a stormwater utility fee, are you suggesting eliminating that, or are you suggesting saying through the collection of a stormwater utility fee instead of the property
Either
tax
one,
levy?
either one. I think for the purposes of the data we're trying to acquire, the closer those two
They should
are
be the
in
same.
reading, the better.
I,
I don't have a preference necessarily either way, but I think they should read the same.
So I do have a preference. I think the instead of connotes that there's a choice to be made. You can't have it always. So I like the instead of.
They both say
but
instead of.
they
They
both
should both
say
say
instead of.
or
I think
rather
that's
Flip
than.
the object.
that's a great point that Bob
I
made.
prefer rather
Yeah.
than, but that's
The,
nitpicky.
the preamble thing, I would just caution a lot, I'd actually encourage a lot of caution on the preamble. Because I recognize the idea of trying to help voters understand what we mean when we say stormwater. But that's gotta be factual and it's gotta be brief.
Yeah.
And so when we say, for instance, VOD is required to address, well, yeah, we're required to do something.
Well, let's work it both ways and see what it
But there's
looks
a lot
like.
of stuff in stormwater we're not required to
But
do.
Yeah, let's
most
work
of
it
the-
up both
most
ways
of
and
the-
see what it looks
There's
like.
dangers there. Yeah, I'm not saying no, I'm just, you asked, those are my two
Fair
cents.
point.
The preamble needs to have a really some caution used in what's said there, and I think those two should be the same.
It's gotta be a preamble, not a pre-ramble.
See.
Yeah. Well,
Oh
and
my
and
God,
if it were me,
Kelly.
I would cabin the preamble to simply stating that we have a stormwater program and it currently costs $3.9 million. I don't think we need to go down the road of defining stormwater. I think that can come in the public information campaign.
Yeah.
So that we're not cluttering things up. Let's give a quick frame to the three brief questions that follow and be done with it.
I mean, it really is chocolate vanilla twist. That's really what we're trying to get at.
Last thing, Mayor, that I've
So
got is I really do think there should be a third question.
No, I wasn't saying get rid of the third question. As written, it's confusing.
Bob,
It should be literally chocolate vanilla twist.
Yeah, and whether it's Craig's wording of mixture, whatever, I think
Yeah,
there
I-
should be a third question offered.
I'm not wedded to any of that.
Bob, with the third question, you wanted to say something that there be a combination or
Yeah.
mixture or something
Some-
like that.
some mixture.
But simpler.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
clear.
yeah, a simple question, but that would be essentially the essence of it.
So far, I'm good with everything.
I really like where we've taken this.
I mean, because that's going to tell us hopefully some meaningful information. Now, we can get, again, there's still the risk of people are going to say, I don't like ice cream. Okay.
Right, but that's,
But,
that's
I mean.
Let 'em eat
neither
cake.
here nor there. Everybody has to pay taxes.
See,
I
and if
don't
both
like it.
questions, as Mr. Ryan said, is a very good suggestion. If instead of or rather than is in both questions, then people is said point blank, neither isn't an option for answering the question.
Well, you're going to get enough people who are going to give you their preference. I think we're going to get some meaningful
Yeah.
data
Right.
back.
I mean-
there will be a lot of no votes, there'll be
Yes.
non-votes, there'll be all yes votes, there'll be.
I mean,
Purpose phrased instead of or rather than.
There's going to be a
instead of B.
significant number of undervotes
Yeah,
in this election. I mean, as you move down the ballot, and
Right.
especially with a possible constitutional amendment that could be a whole ballot
Right.
page in and
People
of
aren't gonna
itself.
reach it.
We could have a two-page ballot again. But the other thing that we haven't touched on, I think it sounds like there's a lot of consensus right now. The thing we have not touched on is the order of the questions.
Yeah, well, and my comment about the order is probably, I think it's still an issue to think about. And I do need to think about it more as I play through scenarios in my head as to whether it matters and what it means in terms of data we get and what conclusions we draw from that data. But even some of what we discussed here, I think has mitigated some of the concerns that I have. With the questions being worded both instead of, and I think somewhat deals with that, although I think the order does still matter, but
Matters less.
it matters less.
Because we are going to have fall off. I mean, people are, as we go farther
Well,
down.
and again, and to some extent, we're going to have to realize that there's some statistical degree of noise that's going to happen. So, what's a meaningful? You know, if it's a 4.9% difference between 1 and 2, that's not going to tell us much. That's a dead heat.
No, the real conundrum comes if 3 very closely matches 1 or 2.
Which is possible, but what does that tell us?
That's my point.
It tells us we actually have a lot of room to work with then. Because what it tells us is the community's all over the board.
Exactly.
There is no strong preference for any of them.
That's why we need a 3.
And if there is no strong preference, then we have to use our best judgment.
See,
Correct.
and,
Move and be done.
Correct.
And I don't think-
That is the answer.
Yes.
and I don't think that we can prejudge the outcome. I mean, we have 3 questions with yes/no answers. Okay? By law, yes/no answers. Can't have multiple choice questions. So we have to have the yes/no answer questions.
On a scale of 1 to 10.
Right, but we'll have 3 questions, but they could come, I mean, I could see them coming out in so many different ways.
Right. And I think there's a lot of scenarios that would be helpful.
Right,
Yes, there are possibilities that we're going to get something that's not going to be helpful, but
That's where we are now, so.
that's where we are now.
Yeah, and I think it will be helpful in making the ultimate decision.
I really do think
It can
so.
be very helpful.
I'm excited about these questions.
Well, and the difference
To be honest.
is, again, that 5, 6, 7 years ago, community did not have
A say.
the experience under both systems.
That's true.
Right.
The community's now had experience under both systems, and I think knows what it was like before,
Right.
knows what it's like now, and I think they can weigh in. They've tasted chocolate, they've tasted vanilla, now they can tell us what they want to.
They're going to go with the twist.
So I just checked in with the team that actually will be drafting these and overseeing this process. We've gotten a ton of clear information in just a short amount of time for the council. What we would suggest is, I know we haven't finished the talk in the order perhaps here, but give us a chance to just redraft these and we'll circulate them and then we'll have another meeting and I think we're getting real close.
All right, before we do that, let's all continue to noodle on this. We're not making decisions here tonight. Probably what we're going to get is a redraft based on tonight's input, and then we'll have another meeting to talk about what'll be on the board at that juncture. But for those that are here in the audience, questions, comments, again, we're simply talking about the referendum, the proposed referendum questions, not the stormwater program generally, although if you have questions or comments about that, I'm not going to throw anybody out. Please.
Judy Roscoe. Am I supposed to give an address, or are we very casual?
Entirely up to you. Not required.
Can you do on the referendum where you do the preamble and then say pick 1, 2, or, pick 1 out of 3 like they do in an election? Okay. And for the first choice,
What was the answer?
No.
It has to be yes or no.
I don't know how instead of would work there. My suggestion would be through the current collection of the stormwater instead of, I don't know how that would fit in with that one. And then my question is, if somebody chooses to do a combination on the third one, how is anybody going to know? I mean, you know that when you have the tax levy on your property taxes, you have increases and decreases. What's going to happen? People are going to wonder, are you going to do the same thing on the storm utility fee? Will you be upping it also, as well as taking the property taxes that vary? That would be my question.
Yeah, good
Like,
question,
okay,
good question, although none of these are trying to address the amount of anything.
But that would be, again, that's something, if you're going to present
Right,
ahead of time to people so that they understand,
right.
that is
Fair
consideration
point, because I think
there.
it's a true case that whether it's tax or whether it's a fee or whether it's a combination, costs only go in one direction. And as we do more projects and as projects become more expensive, costs only go in one direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are increases every year or that the increases are even as much as planned, but that is always a possibility.
And maybe the word combination would be good on the third one.
Well, and this is
Have it on there.
good. This is good because we kind of have a built-in focus group here tonight, so this is really helpful. Thank you. Other questions, comments? Sure.
Can you underline words in the thing, like, in this one, stormwater utility fee, underline?
Probably not.
Tax, underline, and combine? Okay.
What about italics?
Or caps.
Put some in French.
We'll check, but I.
There's probably specified font size in the whole 9 yards.
Oh, yeah.
You could probably put something in all caps.
I think it's always in all caps.
Oh, you're right,
It's all in all
the whole
caps.
ballot's in all caps.
Right.
You're right, it is all in all caps.
Other questions or comments? Sure.
Part of what continues to concern me about focusing on the revenue aspect of this is that I think it overlooks what I heard, at least with some of the comments made previously about the situation broadly And that is that this council, as well as prior councils, are perceived, I suspect, as largely the perpetrators of the problem, in that they have furiously, since the end of World War II, been running on the hamster wheel of expanding the property tax base. And in so doing, have created the problem of stormwater, which now can't be foisted on anyone else, and we discover we have to pay for it. Which is to say that there has been very little attention paid to the environmental impact of any of the development that's going on. And what this is attempting to do is merely say, well, we'll continue to be oblivious to environmental impacts, just tell us how you will accept paying for it.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I understand your point, and there has been an increased focus and awareness of those issues. Is it where it probably ideally should be? No.
And the council intends to do what about that under the circumstances?
Separate conversation, but there are items that are both with respect to some of our goals and objectives right now, as well as ongoing projects, and some that took place recently with respect to various things. One example, just increasing setbacks and discharge from downspouts and sub pumps. All little pieces, I appreciate it, but
Yeah, see,
unless you're going to stop,
to me is conscious.
well, unless you're going to put a moratorium on any development.
Bingo, there's the
All
problem.
right, well, we could, that would be a different referendum.
That's what I just said. That is the issue. You included in prior reports stuff about rain gardens, for example. Is there any effort to indicate how many rain gardens it takes to offset whatever flooding problems we imagine you have in the village? I mean, why not just redefine any water seepage that goes into a basement as an indoor rain garden and declare victory?
All I can tell you is that there is an increased awareness and sensitivity towards trying to make an effort towards not making the problem worse. Is it ideal? No. But it's probably a topic for another conversation, including the fact that 75 years ago, the buildings were built in places they probably shouldn't have been.
Bingo.
Before I was born. Thank you, though. You well understand your point. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Angela Answell. I've been here before, and I agree with you on the keeping the sentence structure the same on both questions, as far as either adding instead of both or taking that out. And I also agree with this lady and gentleman about the concern is not so much how we're going to pay for it, but how much we're going to be paid for it, and how this is going to continue to be assessed. Is it going to go up geometrically as they propose, or how's it going to be assessed later?
And again, fair point, fair question. That typically is a conversation that takes place every single year during our budget. And there have been projections for what the increases ought to be. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the increase has ever been what it was proposed to be. It's always been something less. So even what's been projected hasn't actually been assessed. But that happens with anything. Back in the days, one would argue that road repair and construction wasn't funded at the full amount it should have been, and there were long-term consequences to that. So this is an annual conversation depending on the community, depending on who's in the room. We do try to develop long-term plans so that we can have a program to get something accomplished. Not to get too far off topic, but for example, the sidewalk program, which is a 20-year program as it turned out, to get one sidewalk on essentially one side of every street. And it took a commitment to make that happen. So in order to get the stormwater program where it needs to be, there needs to be a long-term commitment of both personal commitment, community commitment, and monetary commitment. Otherwise, it won't happen.
The other thing I don't see in that is the word infrastructure. Where would that come in those two questions?
Right now, it's supposed to be within capital, and one arguably would be maintenance, because building it is capital and maintaining it and operating it is O&M. But we're trying to take that out and just basically say there's a bunch of stuff, not to be pedestrian about it, but there's a bunch of stuff you have to do to go with stormwater. There are elements of the Clean Water Act that we're not spelling out here either, have to do with water quality. But we started to define everything that goes into stormwater. We we need a third page on the ballot.
Sir,
Please.
The property tax cap, how does that fold into this? Stormwater utility fee, I'm guessing, is not covered by the tax cap?
Do you mean the proposed property tax freeze that's been talked about in Springfield? We
The
don't have,
cap-
we don't have one.
Property tax caps apply only to non-home rule municipalities. Home rule municipalities, there's no limit on the annual levy.
So that's not something that exists in Downers Grove. It applies to other bodies, non-municipalities, school districts, for example, and non-home rule communities. There has been a proposal for a property tax freeze that's been kicked around Springfield. My understanding is that none of those would apply to a utility fee.
Yeah, personally, I read the report that came out a month ago, and I thought it was persuasive as far as staying with the stormwater utility fees.
Well, we'll look forward to your vote.
My concern is, I mean, it's really too bad you can't have a multiple choice question. I think you're gonna get a lot of
Yes.
contradictory data sets.
Yes. Well, and that's why we're having this conversation, is we recognize and understand the limitations of the referendum process for getting information, and we're trying to build that into how we ask the questions, knowing there are going to be certain shortcomings, and trying to account for them as much as we can in an imperfect way. Does that make any sense?
Well, I think, like you were saying, I think you get like 3 yeses, you're gonna throw that guy out. You get 3 no's, you're gonna throw that guy out. And then
Well,
the
3 yeses
subset, I
actually is
guess,
number
it
3.
will make sense, so. The data analysis will be interesting.
Aggregated data.
Yeah, well, right,
That's
right. We'll have to
the
see what
beauty
we
of it.
get, and hopefully we'll get something that's helpful. What we're hopeful is that we're going to get data that will be helpful and plainly so.
Clearly advisory.
Yes, there will be stuff that's all over the map, but if hopefully we get a bulk of information that points in one direction, that will be helpful. And if we get data that points in all directions, that's also helpful.
I agree.
Can
You know,
say in the
maybe-
referendum, please pick one, or just, not necessarily do dots or anything, but just say, please pick one? 'cause
Apparently not.
You can't right now, it has to be yes or no.
Apparently
It
not.
has to be a
Maybe
yes or no
instead of
vote.
showing a prejudice for a fee versus taxes, maybe we start with question 3.
Well, like I said, go back to the order question, just think about it.
Yeah.
I
We're gonna-
haven't solved
next
it,
meeting.
but that's a.
But I
that's
mean,
a
we
question.
keep going one or the other, and I'm going,
But next meeting.
maybe you start with number 3.
That goes to the order issue. I
Yeah.
thought about it enough until my head hurt, and then I decided I was going to think about this one.
Well, I tried to solve it for you, so.
Yes, please.
What is the reason other tax sources are not included in the discussion?
That's a fair question. So, for example, the reason why these two are up here, I'm going to say, is because those are the two that the Village of Downers Grove has had history in utilizing to fund stormwater stuff. We've either done a property tax levy or we've done a utility fee. What you're getting at is, should we put out a fourth question that says, forget all this noise, let's come up with something completely different?
Well, on that point, didn't the Village of Westmont just pass a referendum where they picked a sales tax increase over a stormwater fee?
Well, what some communities have, yes, what some communities have done
Yeah.
is taken other sources of revenue to put towards stormwater. I'll give you an example. Now we're gonna get way off track, but DuPage County had a 1/4-cent sales tax that is sunsetting, and some communities are just letting that go, so it's actually gonna result in a reduced cost. Other communities are increasing their own local tax, so for the average person, they won't see the difference. It's just the county goes away, but now their community picks it up. I think Naperville's doing that. Elmhurst is doing that.
Naperville's going up
Yeah,
more than the
Naperville's
county.
taking it but even higher, and then, but what they're doing in some instances is taking that delta, that newly captured revenue, and they're dedicating it towards X. Some communities have chosen X to be stormwater.
Well, in Downers Grove, wasn't a home rule sales tax increase dedicated to stormwater between
Yes.
2007 and 2011?
Yes.
Partially.
Increased once as part of a long-range plan.
1/4
in 2000.
To go away if there's another source found it, but didn't go away.
So I'm not clear what you're saying is the answer as to why other sources have not been explored.
Just limits of the questions. That would be another question. Do you prefer to have, well, I mean, we can think about that. We can think about that for next time. Is there a way to factor in none of the above?
Just a reminder that there's a limit of 3 questions.
Well, I think that's why we're stuck with these 3, but
The other-
you're asking the 4th question, which is, that's a good question.
But the other point that was just made was, these are the reliable, predictable funding sources, right? And I heard from back here at our staff table, that comment being made, and I say,
That's
Greg,
exactly where I was going. It's predictable. We can control exactly what we levy. With the sales tax, we don't know what people are going to spend inside the village of Downers Grove.
Yes, and this goes back to one of the reasons for the utility in the first place. The property tax and utility fees are very, they're very reliable in the sense that you get what you ask for. Property tax levy, if you levy it, that's what you get. Doesn't matter what the economy is, doesn't matter what the state does unless they do a freeze or something like that, but what you levy, you get, even then you get it. Same thing with utility. It's a fee, you collect it, you get it, so it's very reliable, it's very predictable. And for something that was viewed to be an important capital obligation of the community, we didn't want it to ride on the whims of sales tax. For example, one was during the Great Recession, when sales tax plummeted about $2 million in 1 year. There were a lot of things that had to be adjusted on the short because of that. And the question is, do you want to have something like stormwater rise and fall based on how many cars you sell in Ogden Avenue?
To put a final point on that, if you want to issue bonds in reliance upon a variable revenue stream.
Right.
That's actually
Yes.
That's
more to
actually
the
the
point.
main.
Well,
Yeah.
that now gets more complicated.
But that's
how it works.
directly to the point. This is a bond. A lot of this is funded through
And to make it
bonds.
even more complicated, not having those dedicated reliable revenue streams impacts your bond rating, so when you do issue bonds, it costs you more in debt service.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess in that regard, I would say, are not revenue sources to a great extent fungible in the long run anyway?
What do you mean by fungible?
That unless you're earmarking that certain monies are gonna go into a certain fund to pay for a certain thing, that as long as money's coming in, you all have the option to distribute it however. So that if you're collecting money under property taxes, and some of that money is earmarked to go to, or needs to be spent to pay off a bond, that has an impact, presumably from the perspective of the citizenry, on what other monies are available to handle other projects.
That is true. Unlike Atlantic City, who recently was deciding maybe not to make a $1.8 million bond payment until they realized what the impact was going to be on their bond rating, they decided to make a $1.8 million bond payment. So as a practical matter, yeah, those bond payments and debt obligations take priority.
And just to add to that, Mayor, the fungibility decreases when you get to bond payments because the bondholders and the rating agencies demand that you tell them in advance what your sources are, and you have to actually segregate those funds into a different government accounting fund and place it separately. So anytime you get into debt instruments, it becomes less fungible.
Right, and if you
Operationally, you can, in our general fund, we
Right.
do a lot of what you're talking about.
and if you get a reputation for not being reliable in terms of making those debt payments, your interest costs go way up. New person in the
Hi.
back.
Well, you know me, I've been here enough, I guess. Before I could answer either one of the 3 questions, I need to know, is the council going to look at correcting the stormwater fee calculations?
I'll answer it this way. I don't think, clearly none of these questions go to that point. I think what we were looking at was if, for example, we had 100% people say they want to fund it with property taxes, not a fee, then it's a moot issue. There's nothing to correct because it'll be gone. If the reverse happens and 100% say they want to have a stormwater fee, then as we've always discussed, number one, we'll know that we're going to have one for the long term. I think the conversation about getting rid of it will be over. The community will have spoken loudly. And then I think we've always been open to looking at, is there a way to, particularly given the experience that we've now had with it, are there ways to adjust how we calculate it, allocate it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think anyone's saying they wouldn't be willing to look at that if we have one. And then, of course, if we get something that tells us that we're going to have a hybrid, we're going to have a twist, that means we're going to have a fee, then I think that would be also a fair question as well.
Well, I've begun an informal survey of people all over the community, and I'm kind of guessing somewhere between 20 and 30% at this point of the fees are miscalculated. These are all people with bigger properties that really maintain most of the stormwater on their own properties, and they're paying the higher fees.
Right. I wouldn't say miscalculated. I would say it's calculated properly according to the way it's currently described. I think what you're really getting at is a broader question is you don't like the way that it's currently set up, which is a fair question.
More equitable calculation.
Well, yes, and the question is, could it be allocated differently than it is today? Could there be a different way of determining who pays what? You betcha. And I don't think this council or prior council, or I suspect future council, have ever said they would never revisit that.
The other half of my informal survey, I found a number of people aren't specifically aware that they're paying separate stormwater fees. What stormwater fee, you know? Like, really?
Kidding me, right?
So you may have to start with a statement saying, hey, you're paying for stormwater fees here.
What does your water bill?
I
Those are the dogs and
don't know, I
showers.
just,
Yeah, they gotta pay for it.
this kind of came out in the discussion. I don't know.
We know what Kessler comes up.
Well, what I do want to ask is that if you can give us a copy of this informal survey, we might be able to get rid of this whole process.
How much do you pay?
See what I got on me.
Anyhow, to kind of simplify the statements, I'd recommend putting the first 3 words in the sentence should include the variables. Property tax, stormwater fee, or however we word number 3. So should stormwater fees fund this? Should property taxes fund this? That'll get somebody's attention more than if you put it at the end of the sentence.
Well, that's an interesting idea. Could each one, for example, one, I'm just thinking out loud, correct me if I'm not reflecting what you said properly, could each one and 2 both say something like, historically in Downers Grove, stormwater expenses have been paid for either through stormwater fee or property tax. Do you prefer a property tax, yes or no? Next question, do you prefer a fee, yes or no? Third, would you like a combination? Thank you for voting.
Or, to these questions, shall the village of Downers Grove, you know, have a stormwater utility fee to fund stormwater expenses?
So one of the things, based on this discussion and line of questioning, is we'll look into whether we can actually make that statement as part of the preamble, something like the village is considering using taxes, fee, or a combination thereof to fund stormwater, and then ask and have that preamble. So that's going to be sort of
We'll take that into account as we figure out what the preamble might look like. Yeah, but thank you for that. Other questions or comments? How often do you get to have input on what you're going to see on your ballot, right?
I would suggest to staff, I mean, you know, you were given the direction to come up with referendum questions, you're limited to 3. When you come back next time, don't limit yourself to 3.
Got it.
Put them in groups or something.
Yeah, we'll give it multiple versions of each
Yeah.
item. Sure, absolutely.
You know, you
All right, before I lose everybody.
Downers Grove has a water restriction, and I can appreciate you not watering your grass when it's sunny out because it just dissipates. But I laughed when I got this, we were advised about the storm utility, because I tried to be very careful with my water. I pay like $5, and then all of a sudden we got that, and I laughed and I said, we're restricted to use water, so because we're not using the water, you don't have the money from it, so you're charging us a stormwater utility fee.
2 separate things.
Totally separate.
Totally separate things. The water, your water bill is your drinking water that we have to pay for because we have to get it from the DuPage County Water Commission that gets it from Lake Michigan and the city of Chicago.
Right.
A lot of those restrictions are put into place as part of our agreements with those entities
Oh,
because of usage and demand.
okay.
So that's got nothing to do with stormwater. Stormwater is not the water that comes out of your tap, that's the water that falls from the sky.
Right.
And we have to manage it not only from local requirements, county requirements, but federal requirements for a variety of different reasons. So one thing we don't have the option to do is not manage stormwater, we have to.
I didn't understand there was,
Yeah,
it was,
those
okay.
2 very different things.
That's your village at work, they're putting it on one bill, so we're saving money.
There you go.
Less paper.
Cheaper ink.
Right.
See, that's where I would beg to differ, which comes back to my original point. Because at one time, from my understanding, the village relied for its source of water on groundwater. Where did that groundwater come from? I would assume it would be self-evident where it came from, did it not?
Actually, those are also two different things.
Okay.
Stormwater is not the same as groundwater. Stormwater, again, comes from the sky. Groundwater is something that's subterranean. They're not the same. They have an influence on one another. I'm not a scientist, I couldn't tell you that, but they are very different. They're regulated differently.
I'm not talking about regulations, I'm just making reference to the idea that broadly speaking, my assumption is that rainwater that comes down is gonna wind up in the ground and contribute to groundwater. The village has
large,
grown
not.
to the extent.
Not necessarily.
By and large,
Not
not.
necessarily, that's not.
By and large, it'll run off into the
We won't argue
DuPage
that
River.
point.
No, Commissioner Olson's right, it largely runs off into
Runs
DuPage
off.
River.
Yeah, the aquifers are too deep.
Because we're not capturing.
No, that's just the way, that's a higher power than us.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't want to be Flint, Michigan.
To that point, we also have restrictions on some of the use of groundwater for contamination and other reasons. That's a whole issue of Illinois EPA.
Well, one point I was trying to get to in terms of your comment, though, was that my assumption is that when the village was relying on groundwater, that by itself was putting some limit on the population that the groundwater could support, as would be true of all suburbs in the area.
I can't argue with that point. Other questions or comments on the referendum questions? Well, first of all, I want to thank the audience before I come back to the council. Really appreciate our terrific focus group. I wish we had parting prizes for you, but we don't. Appreciate the input and comments, and clearly this is an ongoing conversation. We do have some time, but not forever, so this is something we want to continue to stay at. Okay. Any idea when we might, for those who are interested, come back to this? I'm not putting you on the spot, just
It's been
orders of magnitude.
usually one meeting per month, so.
Okay,
3
so
or 4
next
weeks.
month. Any final thoughts, comments from the council?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion to adjourn carries. Thank you for coming. We are adjourned. Good night.
Good night.